They didn't rule with crowns. They ruled with money. And history barely remembers their name. History books are full of kings, warriors, and presidents. Palaces, crowns, battles, triumphs. But history rarely tells the stories of those who operated in silence. Those who never marched into battle. Those who never demanded attention, yet shaped the world more profoundly than any king ever could. Behind every empire, there is always someone quieter, someone invisible to the public eye, someone richer, someone pulling the strings from the shadows. This is the true story of a family that built unimaginable wealth, not with armies, flags, or thrones, but with foresight, cunning, and patience. They started small, not as royalty, not as conquerors. They were merchants, bankers, and lenders, people whose work seemed ordinary on the surface but extraordinary in effect. At a time when power moved slowly and visibly, through swords, flags, and armies, this family discovered a different form of power: money, capital, control over resources that would determine the rise and fall of nations. While empires waged war on land and sea, this family quietly financed them. They loaned gold to one side, then the other, not out of loyalty, but because power itself could be bought and rented and controlled. While kings argued endlessly over borders and battles, this family controlled the gold that paid the soldiers, the coins that kept armies marching, the funding that kept nations alive. Their rule did not look dramatic. No palaces under siege, no banners waving in triumph, no blood spilled for the world to see. All they had were contracts, loans, interest. But in those simple documents lay the most formidable weapon of all: leverage. They learned something early that others would never understand. Power fades. Legacies crumble. Crowns tarnish. But money, if managed correctly, multiplies. It survives chaos. It adapts. It can outlast armies, dynasties, and even entire governments. As empires collapsed, their wealth stayed intact. As governments rose and fell, their influence quietly adapted. They never showed allegiance to one flag, because the real advantage lay in neutrality. They funded both sides of wars, both sides of arguments, both sides of opportunity. And that was the secret. Wars ended. Kings died. Dynasties fell. But debt survived. It persisted long after swords were sheathed. It survived long after armies were disbanded. It carried forward the influence of a family few could even name. By the time people noticed their power, it was already everywhere. Banks in distant cities. Industries that produced goods no one knew were theirs. Governments that relied on their financing, unknowingly bound to their influence. Their name wasn't carved into monuments. It wasn't celebrated in grand tales of heroism or conquest. There were no statues, no parades, no commemorative coins. Yet their money shaped the modern world. Every trade route they touched, every bank they invested in, every king, general, and politician they quietly supported, directly or indirectly, built on the foundation of their capital. And it all began from simple beginnings. From small loans to merchants. From buying a shipment of goods no one else could afford. From contracts drafted quietly in candlelit rooms while the world outside waged wars. What made them extraordinary wasn't simply wealth. It was patience. The ability to think decades ahead. The discipline to watch empires rise and fall. And always position themselves to survive, adapt, and profit, without ever appearing in the spotlight. Other families sought power through display, through conquest, through public glory. But glory is fleeting. Attention attracts envy, enemies, and risks. They learned that invisibility was strength, that shadows provide safety, that the quiet hand often moves more than the sword ever could. And so, while the public cheered for generals and kings, This family remained in the background, almost invisible, almost forgotten, but omnipresent in the fabric of wealth, power, and influence. The world changed. Wars ended. Borders shifted. Governments rose and fell. But the wealth they built quietly multiplied. It flowed into industries. It funded trade. It seeded the early forms of banking systems that would later dominate continents. By the time people realized how much influence they truly held, it was too late. The foundation they built had already taken root in every level of commerce and finance. They were never meant to be remembered in history books. And that was the point. Their empire wasn't made of castles or crowns. It wasn't built on swords or banners. It was an empire of wealth, of influence, and of shadows. And it lasted because no one ever saw it coming. No one understood the quiet force that was guiding entire nations from behind the curtain. While kings celebrated victories, this family was calculating the next move, ensuring that the only true constant in history, money, remained theirs. By the time the world caught up, their name was already etched into the foundations of modern banking, trade, and industry. Not in history books, not in classrooms, not in monuments, but in power, in influence, in the invisible threads that connected wealth to control. The lesson is clear. The most enduring empires are not built in daylight. They are built quietly, patiently, in the shadows. And those who understand this history understand that true power is rarely seen, but always felt. What made this family different wasn't greed. It wasn't ambition in the usual sense. It was invisibility. They didn't seek applause. They didn't crave headlines. They avoided attention at all costs. Because attention brings questions. Questions that could expose their strategies. Questions that could unravel decades of careful planning. Their empire was not built on spectacle. It was built on silence, on patience, on understanding the invisible levers of power. While rulers fought openly for control, this family quietly controlled access. Access to capital, access to survival, access to the recovery of nations after collapse. When kingdoms were crumbling, they arrived with discreet offers. When economies teetered on the edge of collapse, they were there, providing stability in the shadows. When rulers begged for solutions, they handed out loans and advice, carefully timed, carefully calculated. And the price was never paid in gold alone. It was paid in influence, in decisions made behind closed doors, in allegiance that could not be traced publicly. Over time, their wealth became more than money. It became protection. Protection became power. Power became untouchable. They didn't need armies. They didn't need public approval. They didn't need the glare of history to validate them. They survived revolutions. They survived world wars. They survived economic crashes that wiped out entire nations' fortunes. Not because they predicted the future, but because they prepared for chaos. They understood risk in a way few ever did. And they always had contingency. Their money didn't sleep. It moved silently from one continent to another, shifted into emerging markets before anyone noticed, adapted to regulations, revolutions, and collapses with perfect timing. And while the public argued over leaders, policies, and elections, this family shaped outcomes from the shadows. Not through ballots, not through law, but through influence so quiet it felt invisible. This is the truth history rarely tells. The greatest power is often the one no one sees. The empires that endure are not always the ones that flash in the sun. Some never need borders. Some never need armies. Some never need flags. They exist in balance sheets, in debt contracts, in letters of credit and agreements that never make it to public record. And in that quiet control, they command more than many rulers ever could. Because the people chasing glory fight each other openly. They exhaust themselves in wars, debates, and public opinion. They leave holes in the system that the quiet ones exploit. And this family understood it better than anyone. The battlefield of power isn't always visible. The true empire is constructed where no one is looking. Money alone is transient. But money paired with knowledge, patience, and discretion becomes immortal. It survives chaos. It adapts to every regime change. It moves wherever it is needed. And while history celebrates generals and kings, this family ensured that the very foundations of society relied on their invisible hand. Every industry touched. Every government influenced. Every collapse softened, not for fame, but for leverage, control, and perpetuation. No single action made them powerful. It was 1,000 small decisions. 1,000,000 contracts signed. Patience compounded over decades. And the most important part? They never needed recognition. They never needed monuments. Because influence is more lasting than monuments. It is less fragile than crowns. It outlives every revolution, every dynasty, every ruler. That's why revolutions passed them by. Wars never shook them. Crashes only shifted the playing field temporarily. And in the end, the world didn't notice. The press never wrote their story. Historians barely mentioned them. Yet their fingerprints were everywhere. The family controlled wealth so quietly, so carefully, that most people never even realized who held the real power. They were like ghosts moving through history, never seen, rarely acknowledged, always present. Because the truth is this: the greatest empires are not built in daylight. They are built in the shadows. And those who understand the shadows understand history differently. It is not the loud, flashy rulers who endure. It is the patient, the invisible, the silent operators. The empires that last are not the ones shouted from balconies. They are whispered about in boardrooms. They are counted in ledgers. They are secured in contracts no one reads. And if you look closely at the world today, you can see the legacy of this family's empire in everything. Banking systems, global trade, finance, economic power concentrated in ways most people cannot trace. They didn't rule with kings. They didn't rule with flags. They didn't rule with armies. They ruled through preparation, through patience, through invisibility, through money that moved, shifted, and adapted faster than empires ever could. And that is the story of the empire that thrived in shadows. Because shadows are where survival, influence, and legacy truly endure.